Hello, everybody. You're on the mic. And with today being Friday, I decided, as part of my, little retrospect mini features on, on some of the classic cartoon studios, decided today instead of focusing on any one of the studios, I'll start that back up on Monday. And talk about the history of the Saturday morning cartoon. Many of us grew up, of course, watching Saturday morning cartoons, and eventually, of course, the whole genre kind of went by way of the dinosaur to a certain extent. You know, coming into a new format on the cable channels. So, without no further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. So, from the early days of the Saturday morning cartoon. Um, okay, although the Saturday morning time slot had always featured a great deal of children's programming beginning in the early 1950s, the idea of commissioning new animated series for broadcast on Saturday mornings caught on in the mid 1960s. When the networks realized that they could concentrate kids' viewing on that one morning to appeal to advertisers. Um, Furthermore, limited animation, such as that of such studios as Filmation Associates, DePatie-Freleng Enterprises, Total Television, J. Ward Productions, and Hanna-Barbera Productions, was economical enough to produce in sufficient quantity to fill the 4 hour time slot as compared to live action programming. Meaning they could basically fast produce a bunch of stuff pretty quickly. Um, while production times and costs were undeniably higher with animated programming, the cost of talent was far less. Voice actors became known for their ability to hold several characters at once, sometimes even on the same show. So basically, that's why on a lot of cartoons you'd only hear maybe one or two, voices, even though they would alter their voices. Like, you might have, for example, on Warner Brothers, you might have, when you'd have, let's say, like Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck talking to each other. A lot of times it was just Mel Blanc talking to himself. A lot of times, so um, that's what they meant by that. Um, let's see. Yeah. And networks could rerun children's animated programming more frequently than most live action series, um, negating the financial disadvantages. The experiment proved successful, and the time slot was filled with profitable programming. Again, the idea of most cartoons was that, since they were more episodic in nature, meaning that they were usually standalone. So it wasn't like there was a chronology like they would have had to follow in like more serial type television series. Um, then until the late 1960s, a number of Saturday morning cartoons were reruns of animated series originally made for primetime during the brief flurry of such series a few years earlier. These included Hanna-Barbera's Top Cat, The Jetsons, and Johnny Quest. Of course, the Flintstones also in that mix. Ross Bagdasarian Sr.'s The Alvin Show, as in Alvin and the Chipmunks, and Bob Clampett's Beanie and Cecil. Um, Again, as I mentioned yesterday when I was doing my feature on Hanna-Barbera, part of the reason MGM decided to close its animation series is they felt they had enough of a backlog to keep running, of old shorts that they could just repackage together for television. that they could go on years for, and it has gone on years even to this day. So some Saturday morning programs consisted of telecast of older cartoons originally made for, as I just talked about, for movie theaters, such as Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons produced by Warner Brothers Cartoons, the Tom and Jerry cartoons produced by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and directed, of course, by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera. For that studio, prior to establishing their own company, the Mighty Mouse and Heckle and Jekyll cartoons, produced by Paul Terry's Terry Toons and Walter Lance's Woody Woodpecker cartoons. Of course, we also had, of course, the Popeye cartoons from Famous and Fleischer Studios as well. Um, During the 1960s and 1970s, it was not uncommon to have animated shorts produced with both film and television in mind. DePatie-Freleng was particularly associated with this business model, so that by selling the shorts to theaters, the studios could afford a higher budget than would otherwise be available for television alone, which at the time was still a free medium for the end user. So basically, the idea is if they made them with the intent to show them in both movie theaters and on the small screen, both the big and little screen, they could actually get a higher budget for it and would help eat up the cost of what a normal television series would have. Um, Some of these legacy cartoons later appeared in new versions by other producers. Tom and Jerry by Hanna-Barbera for their own company. Of course, as we know, Tom and Jerry show of the 70s, new Tom and Jerry show. And later by Filmation, Mighty Mouse, and later by Filmation. Mighty Mouse by Filmation, later by Ralph Bakshi. Pink Panther by Hanna-Barbera with Fritz Freleng as a consultant. The remainder of Saturday morning schedules were filled by reruns of black and white live action series made in the 1950s, usually with a Western background. The Lone Ranger, Roy Rogers Show, Sky King, Fury, Rin Tin Tin, My Friend Flicka, and occasional first run live action series as The Magical Land of Alakazam, and later color episodes of Howdy Doody, The Shirley Lewis Show, Shenanigans, and Watch Mr. Wizard. So basically, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the had a mixture of cartoons that they were coming out at the time with some old West cartoons as well as some first, as I said, first run live action, usually a kind of type educational type of programming. Independent stations, TV stations not affiliated with networks, often did not show cartoons on Saturday mornings, instead running feature films, usually B-westerns or low-budget series films, such as The Bowery Boys or Bomba the Jungle Boy. Chapters of cliffhanger serial films, comedy, short subjects, originally made for movie theaters, Laurel and Hardy, The Three Stooges and Our Gang, Little Rascals, older live action syndicated series like The Adventures of Superman, The Cisco Kid, Ramar of the Jungle, Abbott and Costello Show, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Hopalong Cassidy, Flash Gordon, and Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. And regional sports shows, often wrestling and bowling programs. So this is what was going on in, of course, the 50s. Then as we get into the 1960s to the 1980s, here's what was going on Saturday mornings. The mid-1960s brought a boom in superhero cartoon series. Some adapted from comic books, as I talked a lot about yesterday with the Hanna-Barbera, on the Hanna-Barbera feature I did. Superman, Aquaman, Spider-Man, and the Fantastic Four, and others original, like Space Ghost, Herculoids, Birdman and the Galaxy Trio, etc. As I had mentioned yesterday, Hanna-Barbera had originally produced many of their original superhero series in the 60s, and then later repackaged them as the show Super Adventures, and I think it was '78. Also they included were parodies of superhero genre, Underdog, the Super Six, and George of the Jungle, among others. Another development was a popular music-based cartoon featuring both real-life groups, the Beatles, the Jackson Five, as well as anonymous studio bands, the Archies, Josie and the Pussycats. And of course, particularly with the Josie and the Pussycats, it was not just the band scene, but also kind of under the those meddling kids genre of like the mystery with comic relief characters. Um, Live action series continued to some extent with Sid and Marty Krofft's H.R. Puffin stuff, Sigmund and the Sea Monsters. Land of the Lost was also part of that studio. Hanna-Barbera's The Banana Splits, Stan Burns and Mike Hammer's Lancelot Link, Secret Chimp, ABC's Curiosity Shop, produced by Chuck Jones, Don Kirshner's widely popular The Monkees, and the British-made slapstick comedy Here Come the Double Deckers. Then, as we get into the 1970s here, with the 1970s came a wave of animated versions of popular live-action primetime series, mainly with the voices of the original cast, including the Brady Bunch, aka the Brady Kids was the cartoon version, Star Trek the animated series, Emergency Plus 4, Gilligan's Island, The New Adventures of Gilligan, and later Gilligan's Planet in the 1980s. Of course, that was Filmation that produced that. Happy Days, the Fonz of the Happy Days gang, Laverne and Shirley, Laverne and Shirley in the Army, Mork and Mindy, Laverne and Shirley, Fonz Hour, the Partridge Family 2020 AD, the cast, which I'm thinking here based on how they put this, the cast of the Partridge Family was also semi-regulars on Goober and the Ghost Chasers, the Dukes of Hazzard, the Dukes, less literally adapted was the oddball couple, which turned Neil Simon's mismatched roommates into a sloppy dog and a fastidious cat. Many of these animated spin-offs featured storylines and settings that would not be feasible in most live-action series, such as trips around the world and or into space. The ties between the animated spin-offs and their live-action origins varied widely depending on how much input the original cast and crew were willing to contribute and how much the animation companies were willing to pay for that talent. In retrospective, anime versions of the TV series were generally not considered treated as canon. Yeah, I mean, I think most people got that idea just because cartoon you can do more in a cartoon than you can with live act. At least you could back then. Now with the way special effects are today and computer graphics and all that, you can do a lot. You can do about as much with that in animation as you can you know with live action stuff. There's no real differential there. Just look at the Matrix, right? Um, Other adaptations of familiar characters and properties included Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, Planet of the Apes, Return to the Planet of the Apes, Lassie's Rescue Rangers, and Godzilla. At this same time, the great success of Scooby Doo spawned numerous imitations combining Archie-style teen characters and funny animals with lightweight mystery stories. Speed Buggy and Jabba Jaw were examples of this. Um, yeah, as I was mentioning yesterday, when I was talking about Hanna-Barbera, um, as I mentioned when I was talking about Hanna-Barbera, this brought on the whole genre of the mystery, mysteries with comic relief characters, basically, or as it would later become known, um, the those meddling kids genre, basically. Um, yeah, I won't talk about that because I know that would end up being a bit more controversial. But um, okay. Um, Filmation, primarily a cartoon producer, also turned out several live-action Saturday morning cartoons in the 70s, including Shazam and Isis, with animated sequences. Jason of Star Command, The Ghostbusters, not related to the later move series, but a vehicle for former F Troop stars Larry Storch and Forrest Tucker and Uncle Croc's Block. Larry Storch was one of the main voices in from Filmation. I'll talk more about him and Filmation, probably on Monday. That's probably when I'll do the Filmation studio. Now as we get into the 1980s here, um, okay, so as we get into the 1980s, a which I talked about this yesterday, of course, on the Hanna-Barbera feature I did, a Hanna-Barbera adaptation of the Belgian comic strip The Smurfs became a huge success in the 1980s, bringing with it other series with fairy tale like settings, My Little Pony, um, Monchichis, the Biscuits, Trollkins, Snork, etc. Um, as we all know, Smurfs was a very popular series in the 80s. There spawned a number of movies as well. Most of the genres made popular in previous generations: funny animals, superheroes, teen mysteries, science fiction, live adaptations continue to appear as well. With the exception of the musical band cartoons, only one of note, of course, the syndicated Gem and the Hot. So basically, by the 80s, the musical band concept of the cartoon kind of faded out, while all the other ones still merged in 1980. So CBS and the producing team, Lee and Bill Mendelson, Lee Mendelson and Bill Melendez, acclaimed for their Emmy-winning primetime specials adapted from Charles M. Schultz, his comic strip Peanuts, brought Schultz's characters to Saturday mornings in the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show. Late, Now, as everybody knows, what they're talking about with the primetime specials were those including It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown Christmas, Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown. Those specials are what they're talking about, and they were every year they came about in some form or another on TV. Certain times of the year. I think about let's see, in the later 1980s, the successful Garfield comic strip and TV specials were adapted into the long-running Garfield and Friends, also on CBS. Um, Other adaptations of familiar characters and properties included The Lone Ranger, Star Wars Droid, and Star Wars Ewoks, and Zorro, The New Adventures of Zorro. Um, During the mid 1980s through the early 1990s, series featuring younger and junior versions of existing characters were introduced, such as Muppet Babies from The Muppets, a pup named Scooby Doo from Scooby Doo fame, and the Flintstone Kids. Um, Now, as was happening in comics as well, you know, this was happening a little later than it did in comics. Um, this is starting to happen in the late 60s for the cartoons. So parents' lobby groups such as Action for Children's Television appeared in the late 1960s. They voiced concerns about the presentation of commercialism, violence, and antisocial attitudes and stereotypes in Saturday morning cartoons. By the by the 1970s, these groups exercised enough influence that the television networks felt compelled to lay down more stringent content rules for the animation houses. By 1978, the by 1978, the Federal Trade Commission was openly considering a ban on all advertising during television programming, targeting preschoolers, and severe restrictions on other children's program advertising, which would have effectively killed off the format. The commission ultimately dropped the proposal. I'm guessing they probably felt that was going a little too far. That's probably why they did that. The networks were encouraged to create educational spots that endeavored to use animation and or live action for enriching content. Some of this stuff is stuff that many of us grew up on. These included Schoolhouse Rock series on ABC, which became a television classic. Of course, I'm sure many of you remember many of those songs, including I myself. You had math rock, you had science rock, you had history rock, and you had, you know, grammar rock. So, ABC also had several short form animated featurettes, including Time for Timer, the little yellow cowboy hat wearing guy that would encourage kind of some stuff, and the Bod Squad that had long runs. Just as notable were CBS's news segments for children in the news and NBC's Ask NBC News and One to Grow On, which featured skits of everyday problems with advice from the stars of NBC primetime programming. I'm sure, again, another One to Grow On was another series that many of us grew up on. And some of the primetime superstars of the time, including David Hasselhoff from Knight Rider fame, Mr. T from A Team, Ricky Schroeder from Silver Spoons were all involved in those. So the decline. So yeah, through the 80s, Saturday morning cartoons were pretty popular. So what happened? What happened? So here's what was going on. The decline of the time slot somewhat began in the early 90s for a variety of reasons, including the rise of first run syndicated animated programs, which usually had a greater artistic freedom and looser standards than those that were mandated by network. These programs include G.I. Joe, Transformers, Voltron, Thundercats, He-Man, and the Masters of the Universe, DuckTales, the first 2 seasons of Tiny Toon Adventures, and the first 3 seasons of Teenage Mutant. Now, even though they said that a lot of this started in the 90s, a lot of those shows that they're talking about there, G.I. Joe, Transformers, Voltron, Thundercats, He-Man, and the Masters of the Universe, as well as She-Ra, DuckTales, those actually were all from the late 80s. Now, also in that whole vein, of the idea of, and some of you probably remember these as well, in that vein of trying to incorporate some educational programming within the cartoons like G.I. Joe, He-Man and the Master of the Universe, as well as She-Ra, Princess of Power. They would actually, at the end of the shows, would also have little segments little like PSAs that would usually involve safety or educational stuff. Usually some kind of safety lesson. I know another one, Deeks, Mobile Armored Strike Command Mass, also had some of those. So, um, and as for like the first two seasons of Tiny Toon Adventures, those were they were usually on the independent stations that eventually became the CW, Warner Brothers and CW. Um, and then the first three seasons of Teen, eventually those became um, part of the Saturday morning lineups too. But a lot of the first run syndicated animated programming, of course, were done more on like the independent stations, what they talked about, those that were not under network control. Out here in Southern California, it would have been like KTTV, KCOP, KTLA, and what is now known as, of course, KCAL, what used to be known as KHJ. So those stations. Increasing regulations of children's programming content, including the Federal Communication Commission's introduction of the EI mandate in 1990 and later made more explicit in 1996. This required all broadcast networks to air educational and informational children's programs for at least 3 hours a week. Concurrent with this, the Federal Trade Commission outlawed the advertising of both premium rate telephone numbers and tie in merchandise during children's hours. Both of these factors limited creative options and cut off large revenue sources for children's programs on network TVs that would overrun Saturday morning cartoons. Basically, the idea here, what they're talking about premium when they say premium rate telephone numbers, are basically like the 1-900 numbers. Okay, now many of you know those as, of course, the ones with you call at least for us adults, it was usually marketed. Those numbers were usually marketed towards singles. They call a girl and you get the message there. But for kids, a lot of times these 900 numbers would, well, you'd get to talk to your favorite cartoon character, or your favorite, like okay, for example, WCW and WWF had these kind of phone lines where, yeah, you could sit there and you could talk to your favorite wrestler. Or even like in one case, you got a you could get a birthday greeting from a wrestler or something like that. So that's what they were talking about there. And then tie-in of course, merchandise that was directly related to the show. Like, for example, with Mask, and you get the toy vehicles and the action figures, Transformers, and all that. So that's what they're talking about there. Um, Also, one other little note, as they said, made more explicit in 1996. As I've watched professional wrestling before, I remember even seeing one of the old USWA shows, I believe, or actually, it may not even. It actually was more like one of the old CWA. Yeah, it might have been earlier USWA from 1990 when um, they actually had to change their time slot from Saturday mornings to Saturday nights because of that, because of what was going down. So, um, let's see, the rise of cable television networks such as the Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, which provided appealing animated entertainment throughout the week at nearly all hours, making Saturday morning time slots far less important to viewers and advertisers. Cable channels had the additional advantage of being beyond FCC content regulations and did not have to abide by educational advertising regulations within a year of the EI mandate being imposed. Nickelodeon shot ahead of all the broadcast networks in Saturday morning viewership ratings. Currently, there are at least 10 channels specializing in children's programming. Cable television was also better positioned to rerun children's programming as another source of revenue in increasingly fractured markets. And of course we saw that last sentence there with Cartoon Network and Boomerang. You know, being able to rerun the old Hanna-Barbera cartoons, and since these were actually specialized channels, you know, geared towards that, you know, I think that's partly why that was um, able to be done. You know, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, Disney Channel. These were obviously, and in the early days of the Disney Channel, of course, they would rerun a lot of the older, um, like the older editions of like Mickey Mouse Club, older, Mickey Mouse cartoon, a lot of that stuff. So, see, the increased availability of home video services, both hard copy and later through the internet in the form of video on demand, which, just like cable, allowed children to watch their favorite cartoons at any given time. Again, yes, and as many of you, particularly those anime fans, know, the idea of home video, what they're talking about, hard copy, is like tape exchanges. You heard it, and we often hear from some of the older fans talking about tape exchanges where, yeah, they'll just exchange videotapes of series. That's what they're talking about here. And then, of course, now with the idea of video on demand, you know, through both the cable and the internet, where you can just go on to any kind of streaming site and just watch it at any time you deem you want to watch it. An increase in children's participation in Saturday activities outside the home. So basically, as kids started to become more active, particularly in the 90s, going out to like little league games and out sporting events. And one other thing was happening here too that I'll get to in a moment. That actually goes into this kind of to tie into this previous statement, an increase in children's participation in Saturday activity outside the home. Also, with this one, the gradual legalization of no-fault divorce in the United States over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, which prompted a spike in divorces and a desire for parents to make more productive use of time with their children. Visitation periods for the secondary custodial parent often occurred on Saturday mornings and afternoons, changing the routines of these children from a steady schedule every week. So basically, the idea here is a combination of other activities outside the home with obviously um, parents, because not wanting to get off work or anything, have it, wanting to spend time with their kids on the weekends when they can. Led to these last two statements, and then the strongly continuous growth of home video game systems made by Atari, Nintendo, and Sega, and others. Idea here being is that kids started to actually um, instead of having to worry about going to an arcade to play video games, they actually had their own systems. And many of us probably had at some point an Atari, a Nintendo, or Sega, or Sony PlayStation, or what have you. At some point in all that. So, moving on here, the decline of Saturday morning cartoons coincided with the rise in adult-oriented animation and a wave of new creator-driven animation studios which experienced a revival, much of it on primetime television in the 1990s, as the Saturday morning cartoons were in decline, as did anime feature films. See, for example, the Disney Renaissance. So what they're talking about here is like what we know of today is a lot of the William Street work, a lot of the stuff like from Adult Swim, and obviously, but of course it goes all the way back even in the late 80s there. The Simpsons was the first, forerunner of this, but with animated with animated content like The Simpsons, Futurama, American Dad, King of the Hill, celebrity, even MTV got into the act a little bit with like Beavis and Butthead, Daria, Celebrity Deathmatch. So, as more of these cartoons were becoming more popular, again, the the whole concept of Saturday morning cartoons was becoming, less and less relevant. Um, Fueled by the continued requirement for educational programming, networks continued to carry some cartoons well into the 2000s. By this point, these consisted either of repurposed reruns from cable or outsourced blocks of cartoons imported from outside the United States. As the popularity of these blocks continued to decline and no hit shows emerged from them, and no hit show, yeah. Okay. By the early 2010, cartoons began an outright phase out, with the major networks opting to fill their educational mandates by commissioning live action, mostly documentary, human interest series that were far less labor intensive and expensive to produce, and more importantly for the networks, less restrictive in regards to commercials. Some of the space formerly filled by Saturday morning cartoons would be occupied by paid programming, um, and expanded coverage of college football. And of course, we see this usually every year. Don't know if we'll see it this year because of what's going on, but you all know what they're talking about here. Both of which greatly expanded as a result of separate government rulings in 1984. See where we at time wise here. We're really okay. State of Saturday morning cartoons since the 90s. A 1996 Federal Communications Commission's mandate issued in the wake of the Children's Television Act requires that station program a minimum of 3 hours of children's educational informational programming per week. To help their affiliates comply with the regulations, broadcast networks began to reorganize their efforts to adhere to the mandates, so their affiliates would not bear the burden of scheduling the shows themselves on their own time, thus eliminating the risk of having network product preempted by the mandates. This almost always meant that the educational programming was placed during Saturday morning cartoon block during the Saturday. NBC abandoned its original Saturday morning cartoon lineup in 1992, replacing it with a Saturday morning edition of Today and adding an all live action teen oriented block, TNBC, which featured, of course, Saved by the Bell, California Dreams, and other teen sitcoms. City Guys and Hang Time were a couple others I remember from those times. Even though the educational content was minimum to non existent, NBC labeled all the live action shows with an EI rating and provided the legal fiction of a blanket educational summary boilerplate provided the stations to place in their quarterly educational effort reports for the FCC. So basically, I think what they're saying here is they were able to get away with the idea of placing the EI label on it, even though there wasn't a huge emphasis on it, by saying that because these were settings and these were teen sitcoms, they were set in high schools, therefore the educational aspect was just going to come out of it naturally. And at times it did, because a number of these shows did have some specials that were educational. A lot, I know I know for a fact that Saved by the Bell had. I think Saved by the Bell had an episode or two of it. I think California Dreams might have, well, where they did have an episode about drugs. In fact, I think, as I recall, even with the Saved by the Bell episode, if I recall correctly, I think it might have been Mario Lopez and Elizabeth Berkley, possibly. No, two of the characters even after the show, even maybe may have even been earlier, even in the earlier when the junior high days before, like. But I remember there were at least a couple of like basically anti-drug specials on there. The idea of just say no to drugs. So that may be what they were talking about, why they were still able to kind of throw up the I marker on it, because they were set in high schools. They could say, well, there is some educational in, even if they would try to argue the idea, well, because they're sitting in a classroom and they're just through the whole process of hearing the hearing the hearing the lesson going on in that moment they're in the classroom. Um, Therefore, it's EI. That would be like saying that you could make the argument that the movie Varsity Blues um, is educational, informational because of the scene in the class, the sex ed class. Um, so yeah. So, anyways, moving on here. Cartoons returned to the network in the fall of 2002 after cable network Discovery Kids, now Discovery Family, won the rights to the time slot in an auction, beating out other children's television companies, notably Nickelodeon, which already programmed CBS's morning block Nick Jr. on CBS. CBS followed NBC's lead in 1997 by producing CBS News Saturday Morning for the first 2 hours of its lineup and um, an all action um, an all action live action block of children's programming. The experiment lasted a few months, and CBS brought back its animated series CBS Story Break. And I remember CBS Story Break that started in the late '80s, much like ABC had a program like it as well, with OG Readmore, in which again a program that emphasized reading comprehension and getting kids interested in reading books. In the 1990s, Japanese television shows targeted towards children and teenagers were introduced to American television, including live action tokusatsu superhero shows, Power Rangers, Super Sentai. Thanks a lot to our tokusatsu expert, toy bounty hunters, and VR troopers known as Metal Hero in Japan, and anime shows such as Pokemon, Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Digimon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! This led to a transition in the Saturday morning slot from traditional American Saturday morning cartoons towards Japanese anime, which have dominated Saturday morning cartoons since the late 90s. Yu-Gi-Oh! In particular was the most popular Saturday morning cartoon during the 2000s. Now we could also argue that Pokemon also. I mean, nowadays, they're not on network TV. They're more on those cable channels we talked about earlier. I know that like up in Canada, I believe it's Teletoon up in Canada. I know like Disney Channel here in the States, they'll show some of that stuff on the weekends. See, in 2004, ABC was the last of the broadcast networks to add a Saturday morning edition of its morning news program. In their case, it was Good Morning America Weekend. In the first hour of its lineup, mainly due to internal affiliate criticism of the lack of network coverage, for the February 2003 Space Shuttle Columbia disaster, which occurred on a Saturday morning, forcing them to take coverage from other video wire services. Prior to that, and particularly in the early 90s, it was not uncommon for affiliates to preempt part or all of ABC's cartoon lineup with local programming. Okay, so um, where were we here? Oh yeah, okay, okay. Fox carried little or no EI programming, leaving the responsibility of scheduling EI shows to the affiliates themselves, although the network did eventually add daily reruns of the Magic School Bus to meet the EI mandates from 1998 to 2001. Of course, those were rerun from PBS, starring Lily Tomlin and Malcolm Jamal Warner. Following the closure of its 4Kids TV block in 2008, Fox would not carry any children's programming at all for 5 years until the launch of Exploration Station. That would have been in 2013. The WB was far more accommodating. For several years, the network aired the history-themed Hysteria 5 days a week, leaving only a half hour of EI programs up to the local affiliates to program. Several channels, while not offering original animated series, do air reruns of older Saturday morning cartoons. Boomerang, a spin-off channel of Cartoon Network, specialized primarily in reruns of Saturday morning cartoons from the 1960s and 1970s, the majority of which come from Hanna-Barbera, which, like Boomerang, is owned by Time Warner. Which I loved Boomerang when they were doing this, being somebody who grew up on a lot of these classic cartoons. In the 2010s, the channel's focus shifted toward airing reruns of canceled anime series from the 1990s, 2000s, many of which were never intended for the Saturday morning programming block. So, and I mentioned this yesterday too, and talking a little bit about it with Hanna-Barbera story. Basically, they transitioned from making it like the classic cartoon channel that it was to basically being, as I call it, the cast-off channel for the programming of from Cartoon Network. And as of 2014, all earlier cartoons are relegated to the graveyard shift. So basically, anything prior to 90s. But of course, that's also problematic in that you have Adult Swim Block too and all that. Hub Network owned the broadcast rights to rerun several of Fox Kids' most popular programs. This was a byproduct of the former Fox Kids head Margaret Loesch, or I don't know if it's pronounced Loesch or Lash, but I imagine Loesch, working as the head of the Hub Network at the time. The majority of that programming was dropped or relegated to early morning time slots when Loesch left the network and the channel was relaunched as Discovery Family. In 2014, a handful of digital subchannels also make use of Saturday morning cartoon reruns, including Lucan Communications PBJ and Ion Media Networks Cubo. So, in 2011, the major networks began to phase out weekend morning educational programs aimed towards preteen audiences in favor of live-action, reality, and docuseries outsourced to other producers. Litton Entertainment took over programming the Saturday morning children's blocks from ABC, CBS, the CW, and NBC in 2011, 13, 14, and 16, respectively. These programs were ostensibly aimed at teenagers and families, and networks have legally declared these new programs to be oriented towards viewers between the ages of 13 and 16. The distinction is important from a legal basis as it removes the requirement for programs to comply with the advertising limits imposed by the Children's Television Act. So essentially, this is what they're saying here. They changed the target. They chose to change the focus of the target focus. They, instead of focusing on kids, young kids, preteens, they decided to focus on teenagers, adolescents, basically. That's what they mean by this. And with that being said, that's about as much as I'll talk about with that. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about all that. So let's move on here real quick to this day in each history, and I only have one thing to talk about here today. Um, Today being May the 8th. On this date in 2002, DC released on the newsstands Azrael, Agent of the Bat, number 90. Um, that was released on this date in 2002. DC releasing Azrael, Agent of the Bat. Azrael, of course, becoming Batman's replacement for a time after he was injured by Bane. So, um, with that being said, if you guys want to contact me directly, you can contact me on my Discord. Um, Contact me on my Discord. Um, you can check out my Discord and join if you'd like. Also, I'm still promoting a bunch of different dub companies, and I'm still, of course, promoting the GoFundMe's. As always, guys, never feel like you have to donate. If it's on your heart to do so and you have the means to, please consider donating. If you've already donated, please consider donating again. And if you cannot donate, you can still help out the cause by sharing the link. Sharing is caring. You never know. Maybe somebody in your circle of friends may want to help out too. And if you like this content, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. I always look forward to the conversation with you guys, as long, of course, it's civil and respectful. And don't forget, a little later on here, after I release this video, will be also the premiere of Voices Big and Small, Jimmy Zoppi. Hope to catch some of you on that premiere. And with that, I will hopefully see you guys at the premiere. And if not, I'll see you on Monday. Bye.